Witness, Mr. Mark Slater. Would you please state your name and position title and swear either an oath or an affirmation?
My name is Mark Slater. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Animal Welfare League of New South Wales. I'll swear an affirmation. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Would you like to make an opening statement?
I've prepared a very short statement, if that's okay. I just have a few bullet points in front of me.
Yep.
Firstly, on behalf of the members, staff and board of Animal Welfare League New South Wales, we would like to thank the committee for the opportunity to contribute to this process. Animal Welfare League New South Wales believe that a review of the current legislation is what is required prior to an assessment of the effective enforcement of the legislation, that being POCTA. The Animal Justice Party submission states that data on POCTA is limited. Therefore, we ask that should an appropriate process for understanding be undertaken prior to the assessment of the enforcement effectiveness of ourselves of the RSPCA of New South Wales. To this end, we believe that one thing that is missing in animal welfare in general is an induction into stakeholders' businesses of each, not as an argument, but as a provision for the communication of the goals of any one organisation. We believe an understanding of the policies and theories in any one of the animal welfare organisations across New South Wales are not completely understood by the other organisations. Animal Welfare League New South Wales also believe that all stakeholders to this process are responsible for defining success of both this process as an outcome, but also what success looks like through a societal lens in regard to all animals' welfare, the constant improvement thereof and the education of the public to these targeted outcomes. To this end, I ask the committee respectfully to consider how we might communicate what are good animal welfare outcomes. Should it be through defined different institutional ideologies or a disagreement of values? Animal Welfare League believe it should be focused upon a sustained 360-degree communications program, engaging the public that focus on negating political and media point scoring at the expense of institutions, people and ultimately the very animals we argue to protect. If POCTA hasn't been reviewed in 41 years, how could we possibly expect any one member of the public to have an understanding of welfare beyond anything of a localised nature? Animal Welfare League New South Wales also believe that part of this process should be an agreed factual outcome, rather than, as Peter have stated, opinions based on differing ideology. We need to lift our gaze to the future and towards aggregating all experience into a meaningful process that defines solid legislative outcomes that will meet societal need, without basing our processes on retrospective criticism without context, whether that be about process, relationships, support mechanisms, or the constitutional aims of any one organisation. Animal Welfare League New South Wales understand the frustrations of delivering excellent welfare outcomes in an environment of differing perspective and opinion. For the committee's consideration, respectfully, is the fact that we as an organisation are also born of historical differences, as are many of the organisations and individuals contributing to this process. However, we do not employ these differences as cultural whipping posts. Rather, we embrace and explore difference to find new learnings and methods of application. In closing, the New South Wales Farmers Association stated in their submission that they believe that animal welfare is a complex, multifaceted concept. I'm sure you will agree. However, if I may be so bold, I would suggest that it is a complex and multifaceted profession and process. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll hand over to Ms. Hurst to commence.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Slater, you say in your submission, and I'll just quote you here, that the legislation as it stands does not allow for effective prevention due, amongst other things, to the constraint of inspectors for accessing property where real and tangible concerns are held for the animal's welfare.
Correct.
Can you explain a little bit more about what you mean by that and maybe give some examples of where the Animal Welfare League inspectors have been limited in their ability to be able to protect animals?
Sure. So unlike the police, we don't have the ability to be able to enter a property on suspicion. We have to have either direct line of sight of an animal suffering or be able to build a portfolio to take to a magistrate to then give us entry or a search warrant, essentially. We are hampered by that. Some of the information that we get is personalised and can be based on things like neighbours arguing, essentially. However, when there's real and warranted and sustained complaints, but we don't have line of sight to an animal, be it a dog, be it a horse, whatever, we stopped at the front fence. Now, perpetrators and the POIs in these circumstances, they know the law. It's like wearing a body cam. You walk up to someone with a body cam, you walk up to their front fence, they'll say you can't come in, and turn the body cam off because they know what you're doing. These are people who know, unfortunately, how to get around the law. If we had the ability to respectfully enter a property on a reasonable doubt of an animal being in suffering or not being looked after properly, there'll be high rates of, or lower rates of animal welfare issues, but then we'd be able to prosecute more people based on that.
So what do you do in those situations where you're being sort of withheld from being able to, run your job, basically, get the inspectors to actually...
We focus on gathering a body of evidence, essentially. The best thing that we can possibly do is continue to talk to neighbours. We don't harass persons of interest or POIs. We continually talk to them. We will meet them at their front gate. And just generally try and, our inspectors are always briefed to bring a situation that we want to de-escalate. If you escalate, essentially people will shut down, they won't talk to you. We continue that, and unfortunately in some situations you won't get through the front door. In other situations, and it generally happens in large commercial breeding facilities or agricultural facilities, you will get neighbours start to complain, and then there'll be a body of evidence that is enough to go to a magistrate to hopefully compel them to allow us entry to the property.
And do you feel that, with these constraints that there's potentially animals suffering for a prolonged period of time where you could have, if the prevention of, if some of these restrictions were reviewed, for example, through this process,
Yes.
And some of the restrictions put on your inspectors were removed or your inspectors were given similar powers to the police, that you would be able to more effectively stop animal cruelty from happening sort of at an earlier stage?
To a certain extent. A lot of the people who are habitually in these situations, it's the way they own their animals. They could be boarding facilities, there's people who are currently under investigation, so I can't name them, who use other charities statuses, rehoming statuses as well, and they've got animals out of the line of sight and they've got them in cages, and we know for a fact that we do, but they're hypersensitive to new people, you can't get in, and they've been operating like that for a long period of time. But generally speaking, the damage is done in the first 24 hours, essentially, in our experience.
Mr. Slater, how much of your organization's activity is dedicated to animal welfare enforcement?
Well, we have 20 branches around New South Wales. Our branches have direct line of contact into our inspectorate.
Yep.
We take members on a journey of education. We talk to them about, what welfare cases look like. It's fluid, especially in times like the recent bushfire crisis. So we were on the far south coast. I had 2 inspectors deployed with me. It would have been 90%, 95% of our work on an average day.
Yeah.
Most of our work coming into the shelter will either be people abandoning animals or work coming in from the inspectors. It varies between 50 and 90%.
Okay, so what would happen if the law enforcement activities were taken away from Animal Welfare League? What would your organization do?
What would we do?
Yeah, what would be its raison d'etre?
Good question. We would continue to do what we've done for 61 years, which is, be at the forefront of animal welfare in New South Wales. We would contribute to the legislative process as we're doing today. We would continue to run our branches. We would continue to provide resource as we have with things like our B-double mobile veterinary clinic, which is world's first. So we would continue to strive to be the best that we could possibly be.
Now, in response to my colleague Ms. Hurst's question about a desire for more powers, don't you think that an independent Office of Animal Welfare with those powers would be the better course of action than having the police do some, animal welfare do some, RSPCA do some?
No, I don't. And the reason being is we're bogged down in POCTA, which has been around for 41 years now. We can't gather those issues up retrospectively. We need to look at that piece of legislation. But in the same instance, there will be a huge loss of intellectual property as far as our officers. We deal with the police as a protective mechanism for us. If we're going into a house where we know there's drugs or violence, those kind of issues, essentially. Most of the cases that we get from the police are because they don't have the capacity to deal with it. Now, they could be issues of animals having been struck by a car that need to be euthanised by a firearm. Under POCTA, the police generally can't do it because you can't...
But do you do that?
Yeah, because the animals can't be euthanised by a handgun. That's in the legislation. It has to be a long arm. All of our inspectors are firearms licensed, tranq licensed as well. In some instances, we'll also tranquilise native animals if they can be treated, and then we'll re-release them. Now, that's the better part of 6 hours for an officer, simply because as soon as you tranquilise a native animal, you have to give it all possible attention, you have to go a long way away from a road, and then you've got to sit with it while it comes around to ensure that it's not going to get itself into any further trouble.
Can I just sort of ask a follow-up question quickly in regards to the Independent Office of Animal Welfare? We heard some evidence already this morning that some organisations sort of view it as working with the current structure as it stands, so in making sure that the Animal Welfare League and the RSPCA continue their enforcement roles, but that would be then reporting within an Independent Office of Animal Welfare that would help with the review of POCTA and that sort of area. Do you think that, I mean, I know that that's sort of a very vague structure idea, but do you think that something like that could potentially work?
Yeah, I've spoken with both yourself and Mr. Pearson about this, and we've made no secret about the fact that we would like to be held to account publicly and openly. As a not-for-profit, we are publicly reportable, and we don't hide from our numbers. However, I believe that if you leave the current system in place, obviously fund it better than what it's funded. I think everyone agrees it's not currently funded appropriately, and then have, if you will, in inverted commas, an ombudsman of sort, because currently, right now, and it gives me no comfort that if a member of the public rings me personally and says, I want to complain about one of your inspectors for this, and this reason, the process is no problems, I'll take care of it, and my office as the Chief Executive Officer will look into that. There's no further recourse for that member of the public. Now, that all in the short term seems quite comfortable as far as we're concerned, but it does nothing as far as our reputation or animal welfare organisations are concerned. We see this process and these things happening within the RSPCA as well. People then misconstrue things because there's no follow-up. If there was an independent body that we answered to, I'd be far more comfortable with that. I apologise for speaking over you.
No, that's all right. Can I just ask quickly something that came up this morning when we were talking with the police and the DPI in regards to potential violence for officers that are going in on their own, and we talked about the link between people who are violent to animals and violent to people, and that there is a memorandum of understanding with the organisations and the police, but our understanding is that with the DPI, they said this morning that they often have two officers as part of their compliance going out from the DPI to a place. But I know that for the RSPCA and the Animal Welfare League, with such minimal funding, you just don't have that luxury to insist that two officers go out to any call. Do you have concerns about officers on the field entering violent situations based on the fact that they don't have enough information to call the police in?
Always.
Yeah.
Can I just clarify, are they the local land services officers DPI deploy, or is it DPI?
He didn't say.
He didn't say. He just said that they often have compliance to have two.
Yeah, and look, we had a couple of issues when we were down. We were inducted into local land services the 1st of January this year when we were down for the fire emergencies. The one big issue is that you're dealing with animals on a property, and you will deal with some people who are renegade as well. And in these instances, when you're euthanasing agricultural animals because they've been burnt, and you can't go around and apply topical creams and sort that out, you're dealing with firearms. That's somewhat of an unknown because the variable of a fireground you can't manage. You can only look at and be as safe as you possibly can and quarantine particular areas. In terms of going into situations where my inspectors don't know what they're walking into, yes, it's a cause for concern. We reasonably then employ our inspectors to de-escalate. They're told that no welfare issue is worth your bodily, physical or mental well-being, and they're told to walk away. And if they do walk away, we have a good rapport with New South Wales Police and with the Rural Crime Squad as well, and we put a call into them and we escalate things appropriately. But we don't carry batons, we don't carry any sort of body armour. We just turn up simply because the people who are most dangerous recognise these things as being an escalation. We don't want to do that. Essentially, we want to get to the animal.
So just a question following on from my colleague, Mr. Secord. Would the standing of the Animal Welfare League be compromised if it was the case that you were to no longer be an inspectorate under the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act? Because you were asked that question in the sense if it was taken away, then you don't really see that much difference as to what you'd be lots of things for you to do to protect animals and help animals, including what you've just described in relation to the bushfires. So is the inspectorate a burden?
No, not at all. No. It's the pointy end of welfare as far as we're concerned. If it were to be removed, to answer your question, reputationally it would be quite damaging as far as we're concerned. 61-year-old organisation. And as I pointed out in our submission and I spoke about this morning, the biggest issue is communication. We need to work through this process as an organisation to ensure that welfare outcomes are met, number one, and ensure that reputationally animal welfare is not damaged. As general as if you want to call it an industry, then that's probably a good label.
So you're saying that your reputation may be tarnished or whatever, but not your standing as an organisation?
It'd take away from a lot of our fundraising opportunities, it'd take away from our communications processes, and then obviously give us access to veterinary science, working with the Department of Primary Industries. That's a 360-degree view of our organisation. Veterinary services and inspector services are catalytic to what we do. Essentially, we can provide welfare and rehoming through a foster network. Essentially, so if we lost our rehoming facility at Camps or West Hoxton, we would be able to overcome that. We could still provide that service, but without inspectorate or without veterinary care, we can't be a well-rounded welfare organisation.
What?
So there's just so a question from Ms. Benasiak, or it might be a couple, Mr. Faraway and then Mr. Veach.
I asked this question of DPI about the difference in terms of the number of inspections that you do versus RSPCA, and the Director General sort of insinuated that it may be that you diversify your expenditure into other areas outside of the inspectorate, like your mobile veterinary unit. Mm-hmm. So I guess the question is that the case in terms of the difference between the number of inspectors that the RSPCA has compared to yourself? Does that play a part in your funding of the inspectorate? That you're diversifying your funding into other worthwhile avenues?
No, and I'm more than happy to share it with the committee. We're currently in the first year of delivering our 5-year strategy, or the second year. The first year was a staging year, I should say. Part of that strategy is to expand our inspectorate both into regional areas and throughout urban areas as density climbs in terms of population. And we're seeing a lot of people come to this country for the first time and want to own an animal. We believe that inspectors need to be there to be able to help and support them own an animal appropriately. We're not looking to diversify our inspectors, we're looking to grow as an organisation. Some of our members will joke and say that we've been the greatest secret society for 61 years, essentially. We're looking to, cast off that dust and move forward. Part of our growth is the mobile vet clinic and an expanded branch network as well as an education program.
Okay. And just one clarification about your complaints. Like the stats that we received was 1,292 complaints received, but there was 1,944 attendances. Is that where you have multiple attendances for one complaint?
Yeah. You revisit. So if we issue a 24N, basically our inspectors will go back and ensure that person is appropriately caring for the animal as directed. And then sometimes we have to go back and seize animals as well if a situation is dangerous and we need police help.
And what's the average time that you would spend on an investigation in terms of from receiving the complaint to going out, visiting the,
legislation allows for us to take 60 days to get it to court. We stick to 45 as a benchmark.
Okay.
Is that an internal benchmark or is that a benchmark set by MOU with the department?
45 days?
Yeah.
It's an internal benchmark. And the reason being is it's very easy for these situations to become quite sticky, especially if you're dealing in low socioeconomic areas. You generally tend to start kicking rocks over and you'll find more and more problems. Focus on one thing and get that one job dealt with.
Thank you.
Faraway.
Just following on from Mr. Benasiak's point, I suppose the AWL, rich history, 61 years, probably doesn't have the same recognition as the RSPCA for different reasons. But I've noticed, and you were just talking about your 5-year strategy, and I note that recently the AWL did some TV coverage. I think it was on Sunrise or something.
Yeah, we did a media activation at the end of last year.
When you're out in the media promoting AWL and what you do, and I think you had a large mobile truck or van facility, vet clinic, that was relatively new. Do you see a spike in complaints made because of more awareness of AWL after that's obviously you've got some stats on that, or at least a trajectory, or at least an uplift you can see?
A lot more phone calls come in because, Singer Sewing Machine RSPCA, there's so many times that you'll walk into a meeting and I'm wearing this and it's, infuriating. Steve Coleman knows that, you guys are the RSPCA, aren't you? No, we're not. So we're guilty of not doing a good job of telling people who we are and what we do. But we will be referred to when we're up in the media and we're talking about who we are and the structure of the business, and people will automatically say, oh, right, okay. Localised complaints especially, given the fact that, we're on the doorstep of the aerotropolis, the density, it's no longer peri-urban. We've got a lot of people moving into that space. We're ringed by Fairfield, Liverpool, Bankstown, Penrith City Councils. These are all growing metropolises. Then all of a sudden the inquiry does go up, yes.
Then why don't you just fold your activity into the RSPCA then?
Yes.
The history of our organisation is we were founded by some members, Mr. Pearson's smiling, we were founded by members who took exception to a process that the RSPCA employed in 1958. Those members left with some government and ministerial support and founded Animal Welfare League New South Wales. Our constitution doesn't allow us to do that either, but putting it bluntly, I'd be strung up if I was to suggest that to the members.
Speak our language.
My question, going back, I'd like to go and talk about the New South Wales Animal Welfare Action Plan.
Sure.
And obviously we had the Director General of DPI here today, and he has outlined that that the government, that DPI, that they want to see significant reform, and as the Honourable Walt Secord would say, that the Director General referred to sort of once in a generation opportunity that's confronting them to actually have some significant reform around the Act. The Director General outlined the 6 goals. So the first question is I suppose, how is your contribution around the action plan and sort of what's been done to date?
So we've met with senior policy advisors. Specifically, I speak with Clem Harris on a very regular basis, monthly. We're a bit longer than that just because of the recent fire emergencies, but we deal with the DPI on a very regular basis. I'm in Orange twice a month. I talk with Scott Hansen and have a face-to-face with him every 2 months. He's made fully aware of what we're doing and how we're doing it, down to when we've put together our new budgetary processes and the budget for this current year. I went and sat and briefed Director of Animal Welfare, Kim Filmer, who passed information up to Scott because he didn't happen to be available at the time. So we're very clear with the DPI in what we're doing and how we're doing it.
So you're essentially obviously receiving the grant, because it comes in the form of a grant as a charitable organisation from the government or DPI.
Yep.
And then you're presenting a business plan internally for the organisation back to DPI as sort of for transparency to demonstrate what the organisation's doing, that the money that is being received in the form of a grant is being well spent and administered. Yeah,
it's important to note that the grant that we received, that $75,000, is historically based. It's been around for a while. No one's actually quite sure on the maths or how they came up with it. I think RSPCA get about $450,000. I don't think it's a per capita thing. But what we do is we report retrospectively to the DPI. We also quarterly report in an informal manner. We base our budgets on what's called phasing. So unlike most not-for-profits, we don't spend the money with a view to try and making the ground back up over the next 12 months. Our board's adamant that you make a quarter, you make your budgets, make sure your expenses are what they should be, and then you move forward into the next quarter. And that's how we're growing our inspectorate. What we're not doing is recklessly employing 6 or 7 inspectors with Hiluxes and equipment and all those other sorts of things, and then hoping that we'll make the money back. We're being rather appropriate and responsible as far as our funds are concerned.
Just a final question. We also spoke earlier and heard from DPI around the Animal Welfare Advisory Council, and that the council's been in place for a little while, but there's some structural change around that council, and that nominations are opened. I think it was the 13th of March is obviously the closing of expressions of interest. But I suppose under the reforms, under the 6 goals of the action plan, and possibly change with the structure of the advisory council, what sort of role do you see it having? More of a role, or how can its role in the future under the current structure? Because obviously you've made it clear that an independent body wouldn't be the optimum reform option in your view. So under the current plan with some reform, how do you see the advisory council working with the 2 bodies?
I think you've got to untangle AWAC in the first instance, and historically AWAC is made up of a lot of players. If you're talking about rodeos, then you're bringing rodeo people in, and that might be at the exclusion of other organisations because animal welfare is such a big piece of work. I think what AWAC has to do is being given a succinct brief by the government, by the DPI and by the Minister as to the outcomes that they're supposed to be advising on. Right now, you're kind of eating an elephant one bite at a time. We're doing a lot of work, you're dealing with relevant and current issues, but you're not dealing with how we move forward into a success period and how we communicate the outcomes of this committee, essentially. I think the Minister has to be far more in touch as far as the AWAC is concerned, and I know that that's a timing issue, but the meetings have to be real, appropriate and have proper outcomes, tangible outcomes that can be communicated to the public. I think AWAC at this point in time are recruiting for some scientific bodies on the advice of Kim Filmer from the DPI, and we're waiting to see the outcome of that process. We would and have continued to advise AWAC, and we will continue to advise AWAC into the future. And I've discussed this with Scott Hansen as well, the structure needs to be right, because you can't have 30 players on a committee, some coming in, some coming out. There's stuff that gets missed, it falls through the cracks all the time. So AWAC's a great concept, but I just think it needs to be tightened up a little bit.
So it's ensuring that you have the right amount of expertise, I suppose, on that advisory council to get the most benefit for the 2 organisations and government and DPI. Okay.
Exactly. Because you're dealing with fire ants in Martin Place potentially, or you're dealing with, horse racing issues.
Thanks very much, Ms Abigail Boyd.
Thank you. I just wanted to drill down into the part of your submission where you talk about funding and what could be done with sort of extra inspectors. Just looking at your operations, what percentage do you think of your total expenditures would be spent on inspectors and inspectors' activities at the moment?
Well, we've currently got 6 inspectors. To put an inspector on the road, there's a wage of between $65,000 and $90,000 a year, essentially. You've got a car at $55,000 to $60,000. You've got uniforms and then ongoing training. All of our officers undertake, government investigations, Cert 4. It's a smaller proportion because, in comparison to the RSPCA, our inspectorate is much smaller. I think we're less than a fifth. I think RS at this point in time have got 34 or 30. I think they've got 36 because there's a couple of casual inspectors that they've got that are focused on drought work only, and that the Minister made a grant for sort of October last year. So it could be about 36. So if you want to have a comparison between ourselves and the RSPCA, a much smaller proportion, but that's based on the fact that we have 6 inspectors.
I'm more curious about the link between the government funding and how many inspectors so
about 8% of one.
Yeah, so from what I'm hearing, if the government funding at the moment is approximately 1% of your total yearly income,
I don't think it's even that.
Right, okay. No. It's tiny.
Just to do the maths off the top of my head and be honest about it, I don't think it's even that.
And then you've got about 10% of your operating expenses are for inspectors. So I guess there's quite a decision to be made there in terms of what your funding gets spent on.
Yes.
When you ask for additional funding, would it be fair to say that even if the government was to double the funding, that wouldn't even get you another inspector? Or would you be using that and then taking resources from elsewhere in the organisation to top up?
We do a little bit of that, but it plays into the 5-year strategy for us. We've been very lucky with some of the real estate purchases that we've made as an organisation. We've in the process of selling one of our properties, it had environmental issues, so we've sold that to a neighbour on the northern beaches. We did explore opportunity with a minister over there to see if we could bring that back online. Unfortunately, that didn't come about. West Hoxton, which was one of our original properties from 45 years ago, is full of asbestos and a few other bits and pieces, but because that's now being rezoned into a high density area due to the aerotropolis, we're in the process of selling that property as well. So what we're doing is we're rejigging our finances. The board expect in the next 4 years that we will no longer be a loss-making entity, that will be income generative, because we'll be paying attention to our fundraising, which we haven't done previously, which would then negate the need wholesale to rely on funding from the government as far as the inspectorate is concerned. That's not me saying that I wouldn't like more money.
No.
But we're able to be able to expand on our own terms.
So what would your ideal level of funding be from the government then in the next 5 years?
50%. 50% of our inspection costs.
Yeah.
I think that would be reasonable.
Okay.
If there is an algorithm that the government has that comes up with a number for our funding, I would like to see it. I don't think there is one. I think there's a budgetary constraint there within the DPI and the state government in general. And generally speaking, I think it comes out of the fact that the legislation that dictates what we do, being POCTA, is a very old piece of kit. And it needs to be brought into the 21st century, and I think funding then will start to be realistic, not just for us and inspectors, but in terms of educational and removing the parochial nature of ownership, of animals in Australia. We're the third largest pet owners in the world, and yet we don't have strong regulations and laws and education processes around what we do and the ownership of animals. There's no curriculum in schools, for example.
So we're looking at somewhere around the 800,000 mark for real costs of the 6 inspectors that you have at the moment, and we have less than a tenth of that being funded at the moment, although it's going to go up apparently to 100,000 according to the government.
That's because they're aggregating their grant between ourselves and the RSPCA. They are currently funding a couple of other bodies who I don't know they are.
So by outsourcing what's the word? It's post-lunch session, I've forgotten my words. By outsourcing the function of enforcement of POCTA, the government is effectively relying on charitable donations and fundraising in order to cover 9/10 of the enforcement cost. Would that be fair?
To a certain extent, but we also have commercial arrangements whereby we have a for-profit vet clinic, which is open to the public. Our rehoming facility, there's a cost of surrendering an animal, there's a cost if you want to come and get a cat or a dog or a horse, whatever from us, there's a cost to adopt that animal as well. So there's commercial income there. That's income generative. The inspectors are not. So there are parts of the business that fund the inspectors that are not based on not-for-profit donations wholly and solely. And we do have a managed corpus with JB Weir, which returns between 8 and 10% over a 13-year period.
And that's fortunate that you've got that structure. But again, from a government perspective, they're getting a pretty good deal.
Yeah.
Not bad.
Can I I've just got one quick follow-up just on that topic. I'm just curious as to if you find it quite unusual that, the POCTA is the only criminal enforcement that does require an external organisation to develop those funds, however they're developing it, whether it's fundraising or running sort of a business side of it. Do you find that kind of structure in and of itself somewhat outdated? And that, maybe a shift would be that the actual enforcement section would be entirely funded by government. Do you have any sort of thoughts around that? I mean, in the same way every other criminal legislation is paid for by government.
Yeah, it is, and it brings me back to my original point, and I apologise for being repetitive, but the legislation's old and it allows for that, and that's why we believe it needs to be revisited boldly, and that's the piece of work we believe is most important. Funding will come of that when we know the outcomes that the legislation will drive for us.
Yeah, true.
Thank you very much. So
But yes, it is unusual. Sorry,
and
Mr.
to the
Pearson.
Deputy Chair, Mick Feach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've been quite patient. I just want to go back to the Independent Office of Animal Welfare, or Independent Office of Animal Advocate, or whatever it is, this independent body. But I just want to...
This is the theoretical
Yeah,
potential.
I just want to explore with you. So your earlier answer indicated you weren't supportive of that sort of body. Do you feel that the current arrangement with the ACOs doing the work is a model that can be sort of enhanced and built upon? It would be fair to say, since POC to come into event, that there's been societal change in appreciation for animal welfare issues.
Yes.
So we've just recently had the water theft issue in New South Wales, where the government response was to put in place the National Resource Access Regulator. We have the police bodies, the Independent Commission Against Corruption. Now, they are all bodies that eventually, at some stage, sit where you are about once a year and talk to and answer questions from politicians on behalf of the community about their activities and what they do. So do you see benefit in an annual arrangement where your body, the RSPCA and the New South Wales Police, under the current POCTA provisions, come and sit here and answer questions in front of a parliamentary committee, just like ICAC does, just like the Ombudsman does?
Under scrutiny.
Just to match what has been an increase in community expectation and scrutiny around animal welfare.
Yes, I do. I would embrace it. I know my organisation would embrace it as well. The problem with animal welfare is it's such a variable, and as I said before to Ms Hurst, is that the ownership of animals in Australia is parochial. We haven't written a handbook, but if you look at some of the young people that are coming through today and their expectations in terms of animal welfare, we're not meeting any of those expectations. We do need to be held to higher account.
So I guess there's one aspect to saying, yes, we had this exercise. What was this exercise look like? You know, all of us here have pretty much sat in front of a range of those bodies I mentioned before, and at the end of the day walked away thinking probably could have done that a bit better, or there were some missed opportunities. What sort of things should be scrutinised at a parliamentary level? Is it your annual reports? Is it after you present your annual reports? Should those annual reports be tabled in the Parliament, for instance? I mean, I don't think at the moment they should be, because you don't have the majority of your funding doesn't come from government. But these are some of the things that we should explore.
Absolutely. As a not-for-profit, we're also publicly reportable, so all of our numbers, our facts and figures are accessible by the public. We report in a manner, and our auditors is Hall Chadwick, who are a global organisation, as a shareholder organisation, structured organisation, who are our members and the public, and they expect outcomes. As far as how we would do that and who we would report to, we would happily put our numbers into Parliament and have them, interrogated by members of Parliament. I think the other part of the process, in terms of the first part of your question, can I just clarify that with you again, in terms of what it looked like? And
yeah, can you, if we were to go down that path or make a recommendation along those lines, how do you see that working? What would be? I mean, I'm happy for you to take it on notice. I don't want to just.
No, it's these are and then also in terms of what the success would look like, and what would we report on. There's some very, very simple mechanisms that are being dealt with in the public below the surface, things like cat colonies. Now, and I'll give you one specific example. Cat colonies in Australia, Matthew Flinders bought the first cat here. The cat population in Australia could be 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times more than that of the human population. No one knows, because there's not been a credible big data piece of work done on trap, neuter, release, and or how you manage cats. So these are very simple mechanisms to look at the effectiveness of welfare cases. At this point in time, in regards to cats, you have some very well-meaning, not formally educated but extremely experienced people out there feeding cats and looking after the welfare of these animals, because at this point in time the legislation allows for them to do that on private land. On public land, that's a big no-no. There's also dissemination between what a feral cat and a colony cat is. But if you look at the London model, since 1977, they've been managing cat colonies down through TNR very successfully. But all we're saying in Australia, for example, is that it won't work. My response to that is you have to disprove the model. These are the things that we have to disprove that don't work, and we remove that parochial nature of the way we deal with animals.
And so they're the sort of things that could be scrutinised at a parliamentary level. So you would be supportive of, not as supportive of the Independent Office of Animal Welfare or Advocacy, but you would be supportive of a model where you would come once a year and sit in front of a parliamentary committee and
Very much so.
be scrutinised. And my last question, Mr Chair, so I can hand over. One of the things I'm interested in is the complaint handling mechanism. And I accept that you've indicated that's an internal process.
Yes.
So this is my deficiency. I haven't actually had a chance to look at your most recent reports. Do you actually include that complaints mechanism, the number of complaints and how you've dealt with it in your annual report?
Not how we've dealt with it, no. We will log how many complaints, what they were about,
So the nature of the complaint?
The nature of the complaint, yeah. We're just starting to get involved in drought panels, for example, with the DPI, which is an aggregated body, as I'm sure you're aware. And the reason why there's some privacy issues as well, but we log all of our inspectors' books. They all use handbooks, the same as police, which is another reason why they go through government certification level 4 on investigations. All of that information would be made readily available as far as Parliament is concerned.
Okay, thank you.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair.
Mr.
Mr. Slater, earlier you talked about a difference between the RSPCA and Animal Welfare League, and you said you'd be strung up by your... So what is the existential difference? How does your organization in its activity in enforcement differ from the RSPCA?
It's minutiae, but it's tangible. It's like trying to measure culture. The RSPCA deal with very large cases. We deal with the same sort of issues, but on a smaller level. We tend to de-escalate. We go in with single inspectors, essentially. The differences that we were born of veterinary practices in 1958. Essentially, a well-documented couple of brothers called the Butcher Brothers got in and busted up a gas chamber essentially for dogs. And we've continued. We do the same work. We focus on the same things. We work together if we need to, but we're on very different journeys as far as organisation is
So
concerned.
can you give me an example of how you're different?
To the RSPCA?
Maybe I'm not understanding, but... So what is the difference? I mean, certain organizations I know have no-kill policies, which make them different from other organizations.
Yep.
So what makes you different to the RSPCA? What you do involving enforcement? How do you differ?
Okay. So sitting externally to the RSPCA, I'll answer as best as I can from
Yep.
what I can see. We focus a lot on our membership. We're currently growing our membership. We put a lot of kudos in our members dealing with our inspectors. Our inspectors deal in the peri-urban situation. We're not out in rural areas at this point in time. They're the two major differences between ourselves and the RSPCA. They deal with very large stock issues because they've got more inspectors than us. I think regardless of the two casual inspectors that they've got on, they've got 15 regional inspectors who are actually farmers as well.
So you're more pet-oriented then?
Yep.
Ah, okay.
So pet, companion animal.
Yeah, okay.
So, which is, if I may just add, that we believe that there's no allowance for companion animal. It's just animal. Companion animal needs to be defined because I have neighbours in the Southern Islands who have a cow for a pet.
Yeah.
That's not allowed for in the legislation essentially.
So the New South Wales Leader of the Opposition in the Upper House has a pig as a companion animal.
Had a pig.
Had a pig.
Had a pig.
Pig
Yeah.
got two.
Albert.
Yeah.
Albert.
Very smart animals.
Now, today we repeatedly heard from evidence say that POCTA has been in place for 40 years. It's not fit for purpose. But no one will tell us what their problems are or how they need to modernize it. Even the Director General of the Department of DPI sat here and said, oh, we're going to do a once-in-a-generation review. What the hell are they talking about? What are they talking about that needs to be fit for purpose? What do they need to change involving POCTA? Everyone's talking about this need, but no one will tell us what they're referring to.
As far as POCTA concerned, you can go through and look at some veterinary practices that are allowed in POCTA, pin firing in a horse, which allows a hot needle to be stuck in the sheath of a horse's leg. That's considered a good welfare outcome. That's cruel, essentially, and it's painful. At its basic DNA, that's what you're talking about. You're looking at veterinary practices. You're looking at how you house an animal at home. You're looking at should cats be allowed to roam. New South Wales is the only state in Australia that cats can freely roam, but you don't have microchipping or desexing that's mandatory. So, Fluffy the cat can wander off and cause havoc anytime that he or she pleases, and there's no recourse because we don't know who owns that animal. These are very basic issues. They also lead themselves onto issues, water, clean water, Cats are very dirty animals under their claws. You'll have people that'll tell you that native animals are affected by this as well. Those basic mechanisms, if you want to own an animal,
Yep.
it has to be owned responsibly. I don't think cats should be allowed to wander. Essentially, there's lots of different reasons. You don't want a young child witnessing a cat being run over, for example. You don't want a tomcat, impregnating as many cats as he wants along the road, essentially. Just exacerbates the issues.
You see dogs in summer in Sydney. I come from the country. It annoys me no end. You can walk around the suburbs of Sydney, 40, 45 degree heat, and there are dogs locked up in the cars.
I know.
And these are the
Drives me
same
nuts.
people. These are the same people who think they do wonderful things for animal welfare. They will bar you up and badger me about regional issues on animal welfare, and actually don't look at how they're treating their own pet. They think they're doing the right thing.
And that's part of that basic education. People will look at a dog that's hot and say it's just panting. It's in the car. Oh, I've cracked the window a little bit. Well, actually, no, it's starting to fail.
Yes.
Cooking.
Yes.
That's right.
So, Mr. Slater, what's the Animal Welfare League's position on puppy farms or puppy factories?
Puppy factories. Number one, there's not a universally defined, agreed definition of a puppy factory. There's differing levels of membership to breeders' organisations. We don't believe that, and we've had a couple of cases, and there's a couple of cases being investigated currently, of people who produce animals en masse without care for the animal, who will have, for example, there's a regional case going on now where there was something like 9 or 10 bitches in heat being bred, and then another 15 or 16 who were past that 5 or 6 year of age, essentially, who were then just thrown up the back of the property. There was no welfare for them. They were just left to gather dust out.
So does the Animal Welfare League support puppy farms if they're well run, so to speak? Or do you have a policy position opposing them?
Are you referring to Calico Pets?
Well, no, any sort of puppy farm at all, or major breeding facility.
Major breeding facility, as long as
Dogs and cats.
as long as it's within the law and it's guided by the Companions
It might
Animal
be
Act.
legal, but what is the Animal Welfare League's position on it?
In terms of puppy farming,
Yeah.
high density puppy farming that's done without welfare
Yeah,
consideration.
but what's your position? Do
He's
you
spelling
oppose
it out there. I think he
think
just
he was
answered it, to
answering.
be
I was
fair.
just trying to
Yeah.
answer them. High population puppy farms without consideration of animal welfare or the law, we don't agree with.
Sorry, I just got one quick question. Just in regards to, we've talked a little bit about the Independent Office of Animal Welfare, and I just want, another suggested model that has come up today was that there could be potentially a new arm within the police force where it was sort of like animal cops that would work alongside organisations like the Animal Welfare League and the RSPCA. Do you have any sort of preliminary thoughts on that as a body? I know that you already work with the police, but if there was a special section of the police that was trained specifically in it, because the police this morning said that they don't have the same skills and the same knowledge set as the inspectorates at organisations like your own. If that was kind of as a new arm of the police that you would work with, would that be something you would welcome?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes. For the record, it defies logic that Proctor is engaged and taught to new students at Goulburn Academy, and it's the first thing that they probably forget. Respectfully, because I know the police have a tough job. I wouldn't be a policeman for all the money in the world, but it's got to be one or the other.
Mr. Marta.
Yeah, no, thank you, Chair. Slater, I'm just trying to understand a little bit more, I guess. But you work... Are you a non-profit organisation or a company as a proprietor limited?
No, we're a deductible gift recipient status 1, so we
Alright.
can raise funds for ourselves, but we can't disperse to other organisations.
But okay. So when your inspectors, they go to a property and they want to enforce a fine, whatever it is, do you ever get, I guess what I'm trying to say is, I've heard of the RSPCA, everyone has, it's been around since the beginning.
Sure.
But not many people have heard of your organisation. So it's like having your New South Wales Police Force, then all of a sudden you got Metro Police Force, okay? And you go to prosecute, someone goes, well, who are you? Right, so your inspectors have encountered that sort of problem? I'm
Yeah.
just trying to work out how you can have so many different people trying to prosecute someone.
Yeah, there's a lot of reliance on the ID of an inspector and the registration of an inspector, but local land services currently face the same issues as we do. People aren't as responsive to a uniform per se. If, as you said, who are you? Where do you come from?
Yeah.
Any clown can put on a uniform, essentially. Which is why part of our focus moving forward is a better comms strategy. We sat with the Animal Welfare Committee of New South Wales Farmers Association, and they posed the question to us in a slightly different manner and probably a little more aggressive, and said, well, what are you going to do to overcome the bad press of other organisations and welfare organisations, because you're just going to be lumped in with them as well? And our response was, well, boots on the ground. You talk to one person at a time. You can't do these things quickly when you're talking about individual farmers members in regional areas. And the reason why we were having this conversation with New South Wales farmers is because it's incredibly important that we get inducted into these businesses and that they get inducted into ours. It's too easy to hold each other at arm's length without any understanding, cast rocks at each other for no outcome whatsoever, based on misunderstanding.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
No, I understand, but
Yep.
I come from a business background, so I try and look at it, okay, if government's given funding, a grant to you, why wouldn't you have one organisation and all the resources in the one? And therefore really giving the benefits to the animals out there, and really having the resources there and the inspectors out there and so forth. That's how I'm trying to look at things.
Yeah.
How to make something more efficient.
Our biggest concern is the loss of intellectual property and operational intelligence.
Yeah.
And as the New South Wales Police Force said today, they don't have the expertise in dealing with animals or those relationships. And what we do is quite scientific and learned. We employ behaviouralists, for example, who will assess a dog for rehoming or a cat, be that an inspector's case or someone who's just brought an animal in and said, I can no longer care for this animal.
Yeah.
There's a lot to it.
Mr. Farraway?
Just a quick one. We've heard from some witnesses earlier and in quite a few of the individual submissions that the AWL or the RSPCA passed the buck. I just wanted to find out, in a truncated perhaps response, what's the process? Obviously, as one of the two organisations, you and the RSPCA, what is AWL's process when they get a complaint and as to whether they follow it through? Because I'm just trying to determine whether possibly some of the individual submissions are sour grapes because they didn't get a response they wanted, or whether there is a issue where the workload is too much for the organisations and they can't take them all on. But it has been somewhat just of a little common theme in some of the submissions, mostly individual submissions, individuals.
I think it's a fair point. I think what you say, there's probably a little on each of those, that some people didn't get the outcome that they were looking for, and there's probably some values of ours that they don't agree with, and that of the RSPCA's as well, and also that they didn't get the outcome that they wanted. Again, it comes back to the legislative and legal process. It may have, we may have someone cold on an animal welfare issue, and you go to court, you've got a compelling brief, you put it in front of a magistrate, and you know that under POCTA there's a 6-month mandatory period for jail term that could be handed to this person, and you walk away with a $250 fine. It's frustrating not only for us but for the people who complain about these things.
And it wouldn't really matter who was enforcing it once it gets in front of a magistrate. I suppose it doesn't matter whether it's New South Wales Police, an independent body, RSPCA, AWL. That's not going to change, is it?
No, you can only build a body of evidence as best as you possibly can, and provide compelling evidence. And you're also putting your faith in the fact that magistrates have done their training, that they understand POCTA, and that the knock-on effect or cost to society is enormous, essentially, and that we need to have some outcomes in terms of people being found guilty for these acts that are preventative. We want people to see that there is actually outcomes. If you don't treat an animal well, there's comeuppance, essentially.
The government did review some of the penalties for animal welfare offences, and they did seek some public feedback on changes to better protect animal welfare. And then obviously it's now sitting with the government to review. Did AWL contribute to that process as well?
We spoke to the policy advisors. We asked for much heavier sentences, mandatory sentences.
So would you welcome, Mr. Slater, one of the recommendations, either by the review of the Department of Primary Industries or from this inquiry, that in the education of magistrates that the animal welfare needs to be put fair and squarely on the agenda?
Absolutely.
Okay. Now, I'm just going to ask you, if you could put aside your loyalty to the Animal Welfare League and step back and look at the Animal Welfare League.
Certainly.
So we have a very small percentage of the funds coming in for the inspectorate coming from the government. Most of the funds that are coming in for the inspectorate, that is the inspectorate to uphold a criminal law, is coming from legacies, bequests, donations, commercial activities, etc. Do you not think that that is actually unfair for animals, and animals deserve better than such a precarious, vulnerable, unpredictable situation for a baseline funding for prosecuting a criminal act?
I do, but I also think it's born of a piece of legislation that's 41 years old that doesn't meet societal need.
So would you welcome a change after this 41 years?
Of the legislation,
That particular arrangement?
I would welcome better outcomes as far as animal welfare is concerned in general. 360 degrees.
Mr. B.
Oh, and then
There's
just-
a quick question. Yeah, we
Yeah,
still
so-
have 4 minutes.
It's a two-pronged question, Mr. Slater. So it's to do with your funding from the government. So the first part of the question is, so outside of the government funding, how much does your organisation spend on education programs? You can take it on notice if you want and get back to
Yeah,
me.
if I could, I
Yep.
would take it on a notice.
And then of the money you receive from the government, how much do you spend of that on education?
None, it's tied
So
wholly and solely
so
to the
it's tied,
inspectorate.
your MOU it ties it completely to
That's correct.
compliance? Okay, thanks.
I have a quick question.
Can I just note that we have a secondary agreement with the DPI that's disaster response and recovery for things like the bushfire situation, where we don't get a fee for service, but our costs are covered.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question? This comes out of the Honourable Mark Pearson's question about donations to your organisation and that. So, would prosecutions and things and activity that you would pursue be directed or influenced by donations? Though that wouldn't certain activity be pursued because donations would like that? You'd take up certain animal rights causes or prosecutions that would be in line with bequests and things like that. Does that skew your investigative activity? For example, popularity of cats and dogs.
No. There was a case 12 months ago where we knocked back a bequest because we were asked to expand what we did. And it was substantial. It was $125,000.
And what was the direction they wanted you to move into?
No kill.
No kill.
Yeah. So we believe as an organisation that you can't be involved in welfare unless you're prepared to euthanize an animal.
Yeah,
It's part of a policy called Getting to Zero. We don't accept. We have a core business. Our strategy dictates what we do.
Yep.
We don't move off the sides of that. Essentially, we're very specific about the way we do things moving forward.
Thank you.
Can I have one last question if we've
You
got?
can.
One of the key advantages or outcomes of your organisation, the RSPCA, is that they're able to enforce, I would say, and others would probably disagree, the POCTA Act, but they're able to rehome the animals in a lot of cases, or in some cases, I suppose, euthanize, which is sometimes the most humane thing to do if the animal has gone through significant trauma. Do you think an independent body is anywhere capable of trying to administer that which is actually quite a complex process at all?
Rehoming?
The whole rehoming, because it is a huge part of an outcomes-based process of what your organisation, the RSPCA, do. It's more than just issuing an infringement or a criminal act or penalty or getting someone in front of a magistrate. It actually has to be more than that because it's getting an outcome for the animal.
There's lots of variables to it. The way I can answer you simply is, if you get the rehoming of an animal wrong, people get hurt, and those people no longer engage with animals and or welfare again. If you rehome an animal with special needs because it's been treated badly, the outcomes are far more exacerbated, which is why you need vets. We include what's called behavioural modification plans. We go through interviews with people who want to adopt these animals as well. It is a massive part of what we do, rehoming. Also foster as well. Animals don't thrive in a shelter environment. We're moving to have 80% of our animals in foster and then rehomed directly from foster after best in the world practice that's employed in America. Does that answer?
Yes, yeah, that's fine.
But just quickly at the end, finally, it would still be possible for whatever agent is enforcing POCTA, just like the police have no doubt sometimes, come across a situation, realise that animals have to be seized or cared for, they may seize them, but still it would be possible for the Animal Welfare League or the RSPCA or other bodies to care for those animals, wouldn't it?
We would, but there'd need to be
Irrespective of who's actually investigating.
we would, but there would need to be a distinction between a 16D rehoming facility and an impound facility. Obviously, the 7 and 14-day rule, looking after an animal, whether it's microchipped or not, comes into play as far as these owners are concerned. And then once these animals are seized from an owner who's breached POCTA, if they haven't been microchipped at that point in time, you can't interfere with that animal if it's not necessary veterinary work. So again, the nuances are within the existing legislation that needs to be updated.
And I think it will be. Thanks very much for your evidence. Much
Thank you.
appreciated.
That's very
I'm
interesting.
not sure that I can't recall.
There
There's
was.
one question on notice.
Yes.
And if you could provide that answer within
Cost of
21
education.
days of today, that'd be great. Thank you.
Certainly.